Thank you so much for the invitation to make this presentation at this very interesting conference. I think we had a very interesting morning, very complex, with many different points of views and many different arguments, and at least I got a lot wiser. And you know how it is, you feel when you talk in the afternoon, if I had known what the previous speakers would have spoken about, I would have made a different presentation. But this is what I prepared for you, a presentation regarding the regulatory challenges in regards to clinical innovation. And I speak from a legal background. I'm Professor of Health Law at the Faculty of Law here in Copenhagen. So the question here really is, how can legal and ethical regulation have an impact on innovation, both in terms of stimulating innovation to the benefit of individuals and societies, but also to ensure that innovations are actually beneficial and not harmful. So the issue is how legal and ethical regulation can stimulate innovation while at the same time mitigating various risks and harms, and why this is actually quite challenging. So what I intend to do in this short presentation is first to say a few words about innovation and regulation in general. Then I'll focus on clinical innovation, which is a topic here, and the regulation of clinical innovation. And here I'll focus on the research setting, the part that Lena didn't cover. And I've used personalized medicine as a case study to explore how the existing regulatory framework fits with new and innovative research designs. And then if I have time, I'll say a few words about the need for innovation of regulation. I think that everybody agrees that innovation is beneficial and needed for our societies to develop and maybe even to survive. But and so definitely there is societal interest in innovation, and this interest is also stimulated by regulation. It's stimulated in various ways, but also by regulation. And we have already heard about patent law, intellectual property rights, which is an example of legal regulation which has the specific purpose of stimulating innovation. Whether it actually stimulates innovation is sometimes debatable. I mean, you can have too broad or too narrow patents, which could actually work, could be counterproductive to innovation. Well, a characteristic of innovation is, of course, some kind of uncertainty, and it is especially true when we're dealing with radical innovation which really have the potential to blow up or disrupt existing structures, markets, methods, etc. So there is a lot of uncertainty. Will the ideas be successful? Will the economic investment pay off? And are there any risks associated with these innovative technologies that we need to take into consideration? So of course, this is also an area where we need some kinds of regulation to mitigate possible harms. And we already heard about also examples of regulation in this area, for instance, regulation of clinical trials and the marketing of product, etc. Such regulation could sometimes be seen as a stumbling block for innovation, and some of the speakers today was also mentioning this as a stumbling block, but it could actually also, as Jonathan pointed out, actually be promoting innovation because it gives legitimacy to new product, to innovative product that actually have an approval by a public authority, etc. So actually it could serve the purpose actually also of promoting innovation. We have this innovative technologies, which comes with a lot of uncertainty. There are a number of unknowns that we need to take into consideration when we are dealing with this risk-benefit analysis and how the law could sort of play in this risk-benefit analysis. And this is actually quite a regulatory challenge. because we are balancing in a landscape of unknown. We do not really know anything about the potential benefits. There could be some hypotheses sometimes, and we do not know anything about the risks. There are a lot of unknowns. So we do not really know for sure what kind of criteria we are looking at when we are doing this analysis of benefits and risks. For instance, if we look at the potential benefits, are we exclusively looking at the sort of the scientific benefits, those that we can measure in terms of prolonged life, or in terms of economic gains, things that we can measure? Or are we also including benefits of a more ethical and social kinds, which could be that this innovative technology supports more fair distribution, empower the weak and vulnerable, protect privacy, or whatever. So what are the benefits we are looking for when we are making this kind of assessment between benefits and risks? How broad and how narrow are they? Another example, we could look at the possible risks and burden. Again, it makes a difference whether to take a very narrow approach or whether we take a broader approach. For instance, if you take a genetic test, we could look exclusively at the harm associated with the blood test to take out the blood sample. Or we could include a broader perception of possible risk. We could look into the information generated by this test. Could that be harmful in some sense? Could it be harmful for other than the patient, for instance, for the relatives? Could it, in the long run, give rise to some kind of discrimination or inequity in access to healthcare services? So where do we actually delimit the scope for our risk-benefit analysis? If we look at regulation of clinical innovation, Lena has already talked about the options in the clinic using science and proven methods, or maybe a little bit outside the scope of science and proven methods for innovation. And I think, speaking from a Danish position, actually, I think that in Denmark the scope for innovation in the clinic is much broader. We do not really have that standard of science and proven experience. Our standard is more like you have to act with consciousness and care, and it leaves more room for experimentation in the clinic, actually. But then, of course, we have the protocols and the clinical trials. And whereas the legal framework for the innovation in the clinic is rather broad and blurry, we can see that when we look into the legal framework for the clinical trials or research protocols, it's much more precise. It's much more heavily regulated. I've taken a quotation from the upcoming EU regulation on clinical trials, and you can see here that in the clinical trials, the right, safety, dignity, and well-being of subjects should be protected. So this has to do with protection of the research subject. And the data generated should be reliable and robust. It has to do with the scientific quality. And then finally, when balancing different interests, the interest of the subject should always take priority over all other interests. So this is sort of the guidelines that we have to maneuver when we have to maneuver in this area, and the prior permission is needed, and Research Ethics Committee and authorities will have to use these guidelines to make their decision regarding approval and non-approval. So what I'll do now is to kind of try to test whether this legal framework is actually very useful when we look into new and innovative technologies. And I will use personalized medicine or precision medicine as an example to illustrate it. And here I'll also draw my own experience as a member of the National Research Ethics Committee, where we during the last 8 years have assessed a number of projects in this area. So for those of you who are not really familiar with personalized medicine, or sometimes also called precision medicine and tailored medicine, it can basically be defined as procedures that separate patients into different groups based on genetic and numerous other data. And the purpose here actually is to stratify patients to more tailored prevention and treatment to the individual patient. So it's a new development in the way that we provide healthcare services, both in terms of prevention, diagnostic, and medical treatment. It's sometimes described as a disruptive technology, which will sort of alter the existing way that we deliver prevention, diagnostic, and treatment to patients. Whether it is disruptive or not, we still have to see. But it is definitely an innovative technology. So it relies on data, on genomics and other omics data, and together with all sorts of other data, which can be linked in a big data environment and thus establish the patterns which help us to stratify the right treatment to the right patients. So it is expected to be very beneficial both for patients and for society, for patients, because they can actually, in principle, it should work the way that we can actually give the patient precisely the kind of drug which works on this patient without more side effects than necessary. And even if there are side effects, there are also benefits. So this is the idea. You can avoid the patients get a lot of drugs or other kinds of treatment which have no effect apart from all the side effects. It's also thought to be beneficial for society because of the economic savings when you can actually direct the treatments specifically to those who can actually profit from it. Whether this is true is still also to be tested. We don't know whether it will actually be beneficial or very, very costly. When Anne-Sophie was making her presentation, I was actually thinking about, I see the doctor in front of me doing all the research that you have done yourself with each and every individual patient and monitor. That would be wonderful if we could provide that kind of care, actually. So it looks at a glance, it looks very promising. So how could such a project look like, protocol? Well, this is an invented project, but it's not that far away from what we could see in our research committee. Here we have a project which aims at establishing patterns to stratify patients with rheumatological conditions, diabetes, and coronary artery disease to more tailored treatment. It could be one of these diseases, but also several diseases at the same time. So the data used will be primarily 150,000 samples from a population biobank storing residual samples from the clinic, and these samples will then be subjected to a genetic analysis using a GWAS method, genome-wide association studies, to capture the data in these samples. And then once you have the data, you will link them together with data from a number of other registries with health and socioeconomic data. Due to the vast number of research subjects and the lack of perceived risks, at least in the mind of the researchers, individual consent will not be obtained. So this is sort of the research design, and I look at Kirsten, it could look like this when it's presented to our committee. And then we have to make an assessment based on existing rules and regulations, so we have to look into the scientific quality, we have to look into the rights and safety of the research subject, in this case the patient who once, maybe many years ago, donated a sample to this biobank. And then we have to make this assessment of whether the research subject's interest takes priority. So let's first look at the scientific quality. So here we already have kind of a problem, because here we are dealing with another kind of research that we are normally used to see in the Research Ethics Committee. This is not hypothesis-driven, as we normally used to see traditional research design. It's more like data-driven science. So it makes it a bit difficult to us actually to make this assessment that we have to make regarding the scientific quality. So we have to look into whether the project could lead to new knowledge and which could justify the implementation of the research project. We will also have to look into whether there is sufficient reason to undertake the project and whether the expectations as to the project's conclusions are justified. And we do not really hear anything about possible conclusions, but because what they are looking for is actually patterns here in this situation. So one could ask whether it's actually possible to make this kind of assessment. We could also ask, is it actually a scientific project, or is it just a plan for collecting data, and then afterwards they can come up with their projects which could be more hypothesis-driven. One could also ask whether the research ethics committees are equipped with the right competences to actually assess these kind of projects. We have a number of geneticists in our projects, social scientists, philosophers, even a lawyer. But would we rather need some data specialists, people with insight in bioinformatics, statistics, etc.? So this is a challenge that we are discussing a lot. It's also being discussed widely in the scientific literature, whether there are differences. It's not only a product when you do research ethics assessment, but also when you assess applications for funding and in the scientific journal, when you assess the quality of the papers you receive. And this is just one of the many articles where actually the author comes up with some suggestion on how these data-driven research projects could have a design which makes them easier to assess based on legal regulation, which is aligned with hypothesis-driven research. So what about the protection of the research subjects? We have to look into the right, safety, dignity, and well-being here. And again, we have to ask, but which rights are we actually looking at here? Privacy rights, I mean, when we are dealing with data research, everybody thinks about privacy, and the researchers in this project didn't really see any privacy issues because they would keep the data safe on a very safe server, so what could be the issue here? But we could actually also look into autonomy. I mean, shouldn't these patients or researchers have been asked and have given permission to this analysis? How can we along the line ensure that the patients who would then be could benefit from this new treatment could actually have equal access to it? Would there be a right to non-discrimination, etc.? So it's completely unclear which kind of rights we have to include in our assessment. And whose rights? Only the research subjects, or should we also in this situation look at family members who could actually also benefit or who could actually also be affected by this kind of research? Special issues pops up in regards to children's rights, because normally they would not have had any influence on whether these tissue samples could be stored in this population biobank or not. And what could be the risks and harms here? And I've already touched upon it with my example from the genetic testing. Are we only looking into bodily harms, or are we also including mental and social harms like infringement of privacy, incidental findings, risk of discrimination, lack of control, etc.? So again, it's an example of how these the existing legislation, which is based on traditional research designs, does not really address broader issue which we may need to look into in this kind of research. And this has actually also been heavily discussed in the literature. And this is again just one example. It's an article which made a scoping review based on more than 1,000 publications discussing these issues, and where they also come up with some suggestions and recommendations about how to broaden the scope of the ethical assessment. Then finally, we have to balance the interest so that we ensure that the interest of the research projects subjects takes priority. And this is actually, I think, already a tricky issue with traditional research designs, because how can we actually assess whether what are the interests of the research subject which sort of justifies that they should take priority? I mean, it is in a way quite an impossible endeavor for the research committees, and especially when you're dealing with so many unknowns that we are dealing with when we have projects which relates to radical innovation. Then there is also, I would say, two other factors which could play in when we make this balancing, and which is actually not recognized in the legislation. And one factor could be scientific freedom. It's actually quite difficult for research ethics committees to say for sure, I think that this project should not be allowed. Because if you do not really know whether it could have the potential to bring something good, radically good, should we be the one to stop it? Especially when we do not really have a clear picture of the harms and if there's no consensus about the possible harms. And here I also think that the power of hopes and maybe also hypes could play in. And there's been a lot of talk about hopes today, so I think this is something that I will need to look a little bit more into. If there is a slight hope that this project could produce something beneficial, I think most research ethics committee would tend to allow it, unless it's very clear that the risks outweigh it. So it leads me to my last slide, which is concerned with the issue of whether we actually need to innovate our regulation so that it could be more suitable for this kind of new research design. I've already said a few words about the composition of the Research Ethics Committee, because they must reflect the necessary expertise. That's kind of it's quite obvious, and new research design could potentially require new kinds of expertise. But then there's also something about how we design our laws, and something about basic legal principles, which could be a stumbling block. So when preparing for this presentation, I found an article by a Norwegian scholar, Inger Johanne Sand, who wrote this article many years ago on the regulation of vital risks, uncertainties, and scientific controversies. And here she actually argued in favor for a more flexible legal framework, which is more open to both factual and evaluative changes. But what she argues is actually it should be possible for those who apply the laws to learn, it's kind of like an algorithm, to learn when they proceed. I mean, you make a decision in a case, for instance, in the Research Ethics Committee, and maybe half a year later, because you've seen other research projects, you suddenly become aware of them. It's not okay. We shouldn't have approved the first one, but it doesn't mean. But now we have approved it, and it's the general legal principles that there is equality before the law. So once you have approved this project and another researcher comes up with exactly the same project, you also have to approve it. But if you have gone wiser on your way to these, when you have learned by assessing these projects, why shouldn't you be able to say, well, but now we've gone wiser, so now we change our practice in the committee? This is actually what she argued in favor for. It's very uncomfortable for a lawyer to think of, but maybe it's necessary that we do it. So this is at least one idea to look into. Another idea is articulated by Barbara Prensack and Bioethics in their really interesting books, Solidarity in Biomedicine and Beyond, where they suggest that, where they say, well, harms are inevitable. I mean, you can't avoid harms when you are dealing with new and innovative technologies, but what you can do is that you can actually compensate for those harms. So you say I mean, you have to be very honest to the research participants, but then also promise them that if you are suffering any harm, we will ensure that you are sufficiently compensated. So these were some of the reflections and suggestions. I think there is a lot of work to be done in this area, very exciting work, so I'm looking forward to the discussions afterwards. And if some of these issues are explored in more details in a number of research projects where I take part. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Just asking for a clarification of one of your very last points about changing your mind or something like that. You are talking about forward-looking perspective then, right? Or I guess I'm just asking because my guess, sitting next to a legal expert here, but my guess is that in Sweden, if you have approved, there is no way even for others to complain to have that change. It's only denials that can be. So you're stuck with your decision even if it wasn't, unless you could prove some procedural unacceptance, I guess, or something.
No, I'm not talking about changing the decision already made, because of course researchers should be able to rely on, once I have a permission, I can move on. But it doesn't mean that the next researcher who shows up and says, he got the permission, I wanted too, that you have to acknowledge that. And normally we would do it because we feel that it's a basic legal principles that you have to be, that the legal system has to be transparent, and it's not decided on a case by case and dependent of who is on the board and what kind of breakfast they ate this day morning, etc., etc. So there has to be some consistency. But maybe we have to apply this more flexible to accommodate for what we learn while we are having insights from experiences with new technologies. There must be some kind of mechanism to mitigate this. And it will be difficult to work out, but I'm sure it's just a challenge.